Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar titled Practical Considerations for Tri-State Employers, Setting Compliant, Realistic, and Measurable DEI&B Goals. All participants are in listen-only mode. You're encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature in WebEx. If your question is not answered during the program, our presenters will follow up with you directly in the days ahead. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Ephraim Pierre. Ephraim, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. As stated, we're going to be talking with you here today about practical considerations for tri-state employers regarding compliant, realistic, and measurable DEI&B goals. David, if you can take us to the next slide. Our speakers here today include myself, Ephraim Pierre. I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Department for Seyfarth, and I'm based here in its New York office. Also joining me is my colleague, Bob Nobile, who's also a partner here in New York, as well as Senior Associate Maria Papasevastos. In this webinar, Bob, Maria, and I will be discussing creating inclusive and diverse workplaces for employers through compliant, practical, and measurable D&I programming and goal setting. We are very passionate about this topic. Our Seyfarth team has guided employers through the gamut of programs and initiatives designed to cultivate inclusive workplace cultures. This includes attorneys advising and counseling employers on people analytics, hiring and testing, pay equity, OFCCP compliance, and the like. Today, we're going to explore a range of common diversity and inclusion programming and goal setting, evaluating them against the legal framework applicable for employees here in the United States, and discussing a range of associated risks, while considering how best to move forward with certain programs and initiatives in the workplace. Importantly, our focus is on helping employers get to a yes on increasing diversity while minimizing legal pitfalls along the way. Currently before you is our agenda for today's webinar. First, we'll discuss the current social and business landscape for diversity. Second, we'll discuss the legal framework for diversity inclusion programs and identify the guardrails in this area. Third, we will discuss the three-step process that employers should engage in when crafting and implementing a diversity and inclusion program. Lastly, we'll discuss a range of common hypotheticals, a common hypothetical diversity inclusion programs, and review what we believe are legal pitfalls or best practices. As stated before, during this webinar, the Q&A function will be active. So if you have any questions, please feel free to enter your questions during the webinar, and we'll try our best to address them. If we're unable to do so during today's webinar, we're happy to follow up with you in the days ahead to provide you with our thoughts. We'll move to the next slide, David. First, we're going to be discussing the society and business landscape for diversity and inclusion programming. You can move on to the next slide. It's helpful to first define some key terms and items that we'll be discussing and using throughout today's webinar. The first one is diversity. How is that defined? Well, diversity means the attributes that make us unique as employees. I encourage folks to interpret that term broadly so that not only does it include protected classifications such as race, gender, or ethnicity, but it also includes the different attributes that makes your employees unique. This differs from inclusion, which largely means having a seat at the table. Are you fully integrating employees within your workplace? D&I consultant Verna Myers has a pretty apt quote for this, which is, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion means being invited to dance. Another term to keep in mind is also the term belonging. This has to do with whether the work environment is a place where employees feel secure, supported, or included. You should ask yourself the following question. How do you feel when you're at work? Do you feel you belong there? Do you feel you have a voice? And do you feel that you're important to the organizational mission? These are key questions that help define the idea of belonging. Next slide. Now, diversity remains a critical component for successful businesses within this increasingly connected and global workforce and workplace. Featured here before you is a key quote from the landmark Supreme Court decision, Greter v. Bollinger. This statement has really only become more important over the decades since it's been announced as a decision. Next slide, please. Even as diversity and inclusion has increased in its importance, as well as the programming around it has increased, so has the public's attention to these types of programming, or so has the attention increased on the underrepresentation of minorities. For example, we may be familiar with the Oscars So White movement that was spurred in 2015 when the Oscars had awarded all 20 nominations to white actors for 2 consecutive years. This was a hashtag and movement started by April Rain following those 2 years. Immediately following the start of this movement, you saw a change in the Oscars nomination process, and then also a resulting change in even the award nominees. This isn't only restricted to just entertainment and media, however. You've seen several different industries come under increased public scrutiny to either hire more women or more persons of color. Notable companies include folks within the tech industry, where there have been increasing pressure to increase the number of African American or women within certain segments of their managers and also within their engineering roles. Not only are companies facing increased public scrutiny, they're also facing new legislation that is putting increased focus on underrepresentation. Most notably, in 2001, all publicly held domestic and foreign corporations whose principal executive offices are located in California must have a minimum amount of female directors or persons of color who are directors on their boards. California is affirmatively directing the leadership of some of the largest and most influential businesses to diversify their leadership. So under this mounting public pressure, as well as scrutiny and attention, several public and private companies have sought to increase diversity amongst their rank and file employees and in their leadership and boardrooms. Next slide. Along with this increased attention from the public and through legislation, there seems to be also an uptick in litigation regarding diversity and inclusion goals generally. An interesting study in 2019 that was published in a Harvard Business Review was conducted by Elizabeth Hirsch. She's an associate professor from the University of British Columbia. And she conducted a study by reviewing high-profile litigation filed against private companies between 1997 and 2008 to see whether or not there was an appreciable effect or marginal gain for Black and white women or Black men following these lawsuits that ordinarily targeted discrimination within the workplace or the lack of certain D&I initiatives. This study suggested that there were some appreciable gains following these lawsuits. So it should come as no surprise why litigation is being used as a tool to shape, influence, or in some cases even blunt these diversity goals. There's 2 recent examples that we can see from the headlines today. The first comes from a class action lawsuit filed by former NFL Dolphins head coach Brian Flores. In this class action, he alleges that the NFL and 3-member teams are engaging in discrimination related to the hiring and retention of Black coaches, coordinators, and front office personnel. The interesting part about this case is that it is being brought within the backdrop of the Rooney Rule, which is a well-known diversity inclusion program or initiative that requires one person of color to be interviewed for any head coaching, coordinator, or front office vacancy. The allegations there suggests that Mr. Flores believes that African Americans are being given what's called sham interviews, despite the existence of this specific D&I initiative. Even so, hearkening back to that quote earlier in this presentation, The Supreme Court of the United States will now be reconsidering and revisiting the issue of race in college and university admission policies, making it the third time in the last decade that the High Court will hear a case that challenges long-standing attempts to increase diversity in the country's most elite schools. The court recently agreed to hear two cases stemming from lawsuits brought against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina that argue that certain admission policies aimed at increasing diversity and leveling the playing field for historically disadvantaged applicants discriminates against Asian American applicants. Both lawsuits were filed by a group called Students for Fair Admissions, which is an advocacy group that opposes race-based admissions policy. With this backdrop, it's increasingly important that employers are especially thoughtful when it comes to their D&I initiatives and their programming to ensure that not only are they responding to their business imperatives, as we covered before, but that they're also appropriately responding to whatever concerns they may have around their industry or their business, and also ensuring that whatever programming they're putting together is meeting the legal requirements surrounding these programs. And to better discuss and round out the legal framework for these initiatives, Maria is going to walk you through many of those guardrails. Maria?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. I was having trouble getting off mute there. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so as we consider setting DEI&B goals or implementing a program related to diversity or inclusion, the legal framework is, of course, the basis for how we go about doing that. So the key federal laws at play are Title VII, which prohibits discrimination in all terms, conditions, or privileges of employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. We also have the Equal Pay Act, which prohibits discrimination in pay based on sex. We have the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which prohibits discrimination against individuals who are 40 years or older based on age. And there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. So that rounds out the federal framework that sets as our legal baseline. But of course, we have the state and local laws that provide additional protections, such as prohibiting discrimination based on additional protected classes. For example, the New York State Human Rights Law prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity and expression. There's state laws that expand the age requirements for age discrimination cases or expand the definition of a disability for disability cases. Of course, New York's Equal Pay Act expands the types of protected classes that are prohibited to have pay discrimination as well. So it's important to keep in mind these kind of baseline laws as we are considering the types of programs that we're going to be implementing. Next slide, please. The EEOC has also specifically addressed affirmative action and diversity programs in its compliance manual. So the Commission generally encourages voluntary affirmative action and diversity efforts to improve opportunities for minorities and to carry out congressional intent, which was part of Title VII. And the EEOC believes that persons subject to Title VII must be allowed flexibility in modifying their employment systems and practices to comport with the purposes of the statute. But there is a caution that employers should be careful in implementing any affirmative action or diversity programs to avoid running afoul of the law, given the laws that we had just considered. Next slide, please. So how do we make sure we are in line with the legal requirements? The first kind of key factor in considering is whether there's an imbalance in the workplace that needs to be corrected. The key inquiry and the language used in the case law is whether there's a manifest imbalance in the race, ethnicity, or gender of the employee group being compared with benchmark data or availability data. So this language is based on a Supreme Court case, United Steelworkers versus Weber. And Weber was a case where a company had implemented an affirmative action-based training program with the purpose of increasing the number of the company's Black skilled craft workers. Half the workers who were eligible for positions within the training program, so those slots in the training program were reserved for Blacks, since that was the approximate percentage of Black people within the local labor force. Weber, who is white, was passed over for the program, and he claimed that he was a victim of reverse discrimination. So the court held that Title VII didn't prohibit private sector employers from taking steps to implement the goals of Title VII. And the plan in this specific case was a temporary measure that was intended to eliminate an identified manifest racial imbalance that was present within the workforce. There's no precise definition of manifest imbalance, but some interpretations have suggested that whether there's statistical significance should be the standard to determine whether an imbalance has occurred. So that's whether there's greater than 2 or 3 standard deviations when you're doing a type of statistical analysis. But the Weber case and our case law and the basis of this manifest imbalance language, it shows us that it really should be based on analytics that are specific to the employer and to the jobs that are at issue. So in doing that, it would be a comparison of the workforce composition in the jobs with the external availability of who you would reasonably expect to see in those jobs. Where the job requires special training, the comparison would then be to the people in the labor force who have the relevant qualifications. And in terms of where you get this external availability data, it should be a reputable source and have supportable methods for gathering the data used for this benchmarking. Commonly, census or EEOC data would be used for this purpose. Next slide, please. The next key factor that we look at in evaluating the legality of a DEI&B initiative would be to confirm that the initiative has a remedial purpose and is limited in time and scope. The action must really be to solve or remedy an imbalance, and it must be narrowly tailored to address that imbalance that you've identified. It should also be temporary and remedial in its intent. So similar to what the Weber case had shown us, there was an imbalance in the workforce based on what the data showed, and that led to a program that was to remedy that imbalance. The goal, again, should be to solve the manifest imbalance and not to maintain a racial or gender balance. There is a distinction there in trying to get to a certain point instead of trying to have an overall maintenance goal. And the remedy should be reviewed periodically to determine if there continues to be a manifest imbalance as you're continuing through the program. The next key factor for evaluating legality of a program is this language used in the case law about not trammeling on the rights of others. So any kind of plan can't unnecessarily trammel on the rights of other employees and should not be exclusionary to other employees. Those programs should be narrowly tailored. and they cannot insulate a category of applicants with certain desired qualifications from competing with other applicants. In other words, there's no illegal quotas that are permitted, and race or sex can't be the sole factor in what you are considering in promoting or hiring someone. Basically, you can't be interfering with the rights of another employee to further your goals. Next slide, please. So while race and sex cannot be the sole factor in promotion or hiring, we do know from the case law that diversity can be a plus factor. So programs that are not specifically preference programs have less risk under the law, but Title VII doesn't bar employers from favoring women and minorities under specific circumstances. Diversity goals should further a compelling interest, of which racial or ethnic origin is but a single, though important, element. So in other words, a holistic approach should be used in identifying and considering individuals' qualifications for a job. Diversity can be taken into consideration, but it must be along with other qualifications that the applicant or employee has. And the key Supreme Court decision on this is Johnson versus Transportation Agency that permitted preferences where there's a substantial imbalance in the workforce. And in that case, basically 2 employees were being considered for promotion, a man and a woman. Both candidates were qualified for the job, but the Santa Clara Transportation Agency promoted the woman in part because of her sex, along with several other considerations. The agency had an affirmative action plan in place, so consideration of the sex of applicants for the jobs at issue was considered justified based on the existence of a manifest imbalance that represented the underrepresentation of women in the certain job categories. And there wasn't a specific set aside for a certain number of positions that were reserved for minorities, which would not be permitted. It rather allowed for the consideration of ethnicity or sex as a factor when you are evaluating the qualifications of candidates. So that type of plan has been found to be acceptable and consistent with the legal requirements. So next slide, please. I will turn it over to Bob to go through the specific 3-step framework for addressing and implementing these types of goals and plans.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Ephraim. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to really expand on what Ephraim and Maria have been saying by really looking at the specific program that each of you may wish to consider in taking diversity initiatives. The next slide, please. EEOC, in its own guidelines, really sets forth 3 steps that employers should consider when embarking on a voluntary affirmative action program. And I know some of you out there who are lawyers are going to get pushback from your HR folks who don't like the term affirmative action. Frankly, EEOC kind of uses the terms interchangeably. You don't have to call it a voluntary affirmative action program. You can call it a voluntary diversity initiative program, or whatever you choose. It really doesn't make a difference. But point number 1, and if we can move to the next slide. Step number 1 is really making sure your entire program is embodied in a nice, neat document. This document, and again, I'm going to call it the voluntary AAP, frankly, is the document that's going to be your best defense in the event of litigation. And the document will set forth a number of things, It's going to set forth the purpose of the program. It's going to set forth the good faith efforts that your company is going to take to meet its challenges and to enhance diversity in the workforce. It's going to encompass a look back to see how we did, what kind of progress did we make towards diversity goals. And all of this will be nice, neatly packaged into the voluntary program. One of the first things that we recommend, and actually EEOC recommends, is conducting a privileged self-critical analysis. And frankly, what we have to do is we have to find out where we have areas of underrepresentation in our workforce. If in fact we are a fully balanced employer, and frankly, I deal with a lot of companies, and I don't know any that are fully utilized with respect to minorities and women at all levels. So your analysis is going to point out where you have areas where you need to focus in terms of developing those programs and taking those special initiatives. And the one other thing I'll say up front is, quite frankly, and the NFL is a good example for what I'm about to say, if you're going to embark on a program such as the Rooney Rule, make sure you follow the program. If you give it lip service and you start interviewing minorities for the sake of interviewing minorities and no progress is being made, as a matter of fact, if you look at the NFL statistics, Rooney Rule went into effect, I think, in 2001. We had more black coaches then than we do now. So I'm not exactly sure how effective the rule has been, but you have to follow the program that you're going to implement, or else it could be a source of litigation, which the NFL is finding out right now, and you may wind up on the short end of the stick. Next slide, please. In connection with the analysis, the purpose of the analysis, of course, is to identify areas of what we call underutilization, where we have fewer women or minorities, respectively, given their availability either within our own organization or in the external labor areas in which we recruit. We have to make sure that we do an accurate comparison. For example, we don't want to look at broad levels of jobs. You can't go to your EEO-1 form and say, let's look at the EEO categories. How many people do we have in clerical jobs in comparison to people who are available in the labor market, or how many people in management jobs? The reason for that is quite simple. A manager is not necessarily a manager. You have people who are sales managers, who are technical managers, who are administrative managers. And the bottom line is you have to be comparing apples to apples. So when you start looking at your own jobs, find positions within your organization where the individuals are similarly situated, and then you'll do the appropriate comparison using the appropriate statistics in the labor markets in which you recruit. So, for example, if you're looking at a bunch of professional positions, you want to compare your IT professionals with IT statistics. You want to compare your finance professionals with statistics for finance professionals in the labor market, and so on. If you just lump all professionals in together, frankly, your analysis will be meaningless and the results will be skewed. Next slide, please. The next issue is which external data do we use? Maria mentioned the census data in her presentation. The BLS has produced information. There are a number of consulting firms that do their own surveys and produce information. One of the things you have to be concerned about, however, when you use data which is industry specific, is that you may not be getting true numbers of the representation of qualified women and minorities in the labor market. So, for example, if you looked at financial services and you looked at the representation of women or minorities in brokerage jobs or financial consulting jobs, the number is likely to be relatively low. And if you wanted to use that as your benchmark, quite frankly, and are establishing goals based on those numbers, you're not going to be making much progress over the years if your sights are set relatively low. So using, for example, more general industry statistics might be more beneficial in establishing goals. In addition, you have to look at your feeder jobs. That is, the people within your organization who feed into higher level positions. And when you look at feeder jobs, be sure to look at only those people who are qualified to be promoted. You can't take everyone, for example, who's in a clerical role and assume that they are qualified to move into supervisory positions or technical positions. People have to have the requisite skills. So make sure when you're looking at feeder jobs, you're looking at people who are qualified to, in effect, move into higher level positions. Next slide, please. One of the things you want to avoid also is looking at population statistics alone. And as I just mentioned, considering everyone who's in a particular feeder pool. For example, not uncommon for management to say, well, let's look at the population of Blacks or Hispanics in the New York City market. After all, we're a New York City employer, so our statistics should mirror the population statistics. Well, if you looked at the representation of Blacks, for example, in New York City, the census data tells us it's approximately 25% of the population in New York. 25% may be an attainable number. At certain levels, it may not be at higher levels, maybe over time, but not necessarily initially. So you have to be very careful about using population statistics. And one of the things that always amazes me is, and I heard this from a number of broadcasters who were talking about the Flores case. Well, we have 72% of the players in the NFL are Black. That means we should have more Black coaches. Well, the answer is we all agree we should have more Black coaches. But looking at 72% of the players, we can't conclude that every one of those players is qualified to be a coach in the National Football League, or quite frankly, has an interest in being a coach in the National Football League. So make sure the statistics we use are much more targeted so that we are, again, comparing apples to apples, setting realistic benchmarks, and then, of course, embarking on those programs to help us attain our goals. Implementing your action. All right, so we do our analyses, we determine where we have underrepresentation in a particular area, and now we have to set goals. What kind of goals are realistic? What kind of goals are attainable? And there are two ways to look at goals. You can look at them in the short term, and you can look at them on a long-range basis. For those of you who are government contractors, you may recall that years ago, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs used to require employers, government contractors, to have two sets of goals, those that were short-term and those that were their long-term 5-year goals. And then, of course, the OFCCP would say, what are the plans that you, Mr. Contractor, are going to put into place to help the company get there in the long term? It's very difficult sometimes to establish short-term goals, I should say, because frankly, you may not have opportunities to fill in the coming year. If you don't expand your workforce, you don't have turnover, where are the openings going to come into play? So looking at it from a more long-range perspective is typically better for most employers. You also need to take a look at what practices within your organization might be impeding your ability to facilitate diversity and placement of women and minorities. For example, I often hear clients say to me, you know, we're looking for more Blacks in managerial jobs, in professional jobs. We can't find them. And I say, well, you know, what kind of criteria have you established when hiring? And I've actually had people tell me, well, we have a policy that we only recruit at Ivy League schools. Well, there are a lot of other companies that are recruiting at Ivy League schools also, but bear in mind, does recruiting at an Ivy League school mean you're necessarily going to get some key talent that might be available? And I like to take a look at some of our larger corporations just to point out that you don't have to be a graduate of Harvard or Yale to be successful. CEO of Goldman Sachs. Anyone have an idea where he went to college? Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth? No, he went to Hamilton College. Anyone know where Hamilton College is? Small little liberal arts school. CEO of UPS went to Daniels College. Honestly, I never heard of Daniels College before I did a little research to prepare for today. CEO of Thomson Reuters went to Marshall University. The only person I ever knew who came out of Marshall was Chad Pennington, a quarterback of the Jets, years ago. CEO of MetLife went to Syracuse. CEO of Walmart went to the University of Tulsa. So the list goes on and on. When someone in your organization says, we've got to go to Ivy League schools or the top 10 MBA programs in the country to get the best talent, that's not necessarily the case. Next slide, please. So now we have our goals, we have our program, and now the question is, how do we expand our applicant pool? And a key issue here in connection with hiring and placement of protected group members, in particular minorities, women, and even other protected groups. The key is to expand your applicant pool. Remember, the Rooney Rule, frankly, is designed to expand the pool, but unfortunately the teams never took it a step further and started engaging in meaningful hiring. We have to move qualified people into that pool. And one of the cases Maria mentioned was the Johnson case, one of my favorite cases, and I'll tell you why. Supreme Court in Johnson made a couple of very key pronouncements. First of all, they looked at the qualifications of the male who brought the suit. It was a reverse discrimination suit. And they looked at the qualifications of the woman who ultimately got the job. And she got the job because the director of that program said, we got to start taking affirmative action around here. We have 100 employees in this road dispatcher job. And guess what? We don't have any women. So when these two candidates came up and they both interviewed, the question is, who was the most qualified? The male, by the way, got a higher score on a civil service test that both candidates had to take. But when they were interviewed, some of the people liked the woman better, and some said, we should also consider giving her a preference because she is female and we have a substantial imbalance in the workforce. So she got the job. We then had the lawsuit. Supreme Court said that as long as an employer hires from the qualified applicant pool, all right, the employer is following the law. And the court went on to say, where is it written that an employer must hire the most qualified candidate? And by the way, who is the most qualified candidate when qualifications are at best subjective? So the case gives us a fair amount of latitude to hire whoever we want from a qualified applicant pool. And as Maria mentioned earlier, to grant preferences. And by the way, we don't recommend doing that lightly. You have to have the predicate in place first. You do your analyses. You show you have the substantial underrepresentation or substantial imbalance, and that gives you the right then to move forward and do what you need to do in terms of hiring. But the key is getting the people into the applicant pools from which you can make meaningful employment decisions. What kind of programs will enable us, by the way, to expand our reach? Let me give you just one example, and it's an example that occurred about maybe 10 years ago with a large company in the transportation industry that I represent. The company had a job group. The group in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, had 1,000 mechanics. These were folks who fixed their trucks, their cars, their aircraft. And out of the 1,000, if you want to take a guess, how many women do you think they had in that job group? The answer was 0. They did not have any. And the head of their human resources department said, this is totally unacceptable. We need to take some initiatives to expand our pool of qualified women. And the head of HR said, how are we recruiting for these folks? And by the way, you know what they were doing? They were placing an ad literally in the Daily News, New York newspaper. And when they placed the ad, they got plenty of candidates. They never had a problem finding qualified candidates, all right? Except they weren't recruiting any women because no women were applying. So the head of HR said, we got to do more. Let's put together a committee. And by the way, we always recommend you put a committee in place. Let's call it your diversity committee, because the more people on that committee, the more objective your decisions are ultimately going to be viewed by a third party. So they put together a committee, and the committee sat around the table. And I had the good fortune of being on that committee as their outside counsel. And they started talking about, what are we going to do? So the first person said, I tell you what, let's put an ad in Working Mothers magazine, all right? Remember, they were looking for women. And one of the other HR people said to me, Bob, isn't that unlawful? We're advertising in a women's publication. I said, no, it's not unlawful. That's not the only thing you're doing. You're still going to run your ad in the Daily News. You're still going to look for other sources, but that is another source that may help you attract candidates. P.S., first year alone, they got 10 candidates from the ads that they placed in Working Mothers magazine. Out of the 10, they hired 6. So we went from 0 to 6 in 1 year. One of the other people on the committee said, I think we ought to go to the U.S. military bases in the tri-state area, because the military has a great reputation for training women in non-traditional jobs, which they do, by the way. They went to the military. They started making contacts with the placement folks. These were the military service personnel who had responsibility for placing people when they were leaving the military. And out of the military, over the next 2 years, they were able to recruit 20 additional people in that particular job group as women. So the bottom line is just expanding the type of sources that you're using, frankly, are going to inevitably yield more diversity for your applicant pool, and again, more people from which you can choose. So where do we look? There are so many organizations out there. Just to name a few, diversity.com, which reaches all groups, minorities, women, LGBTQ. The Black Career Network, obviously focusing on African Americans, Hispanic Latino professionals, Vets Connect, Disability Connect, for the LGBTQ community, Out and Equal, Power to Fly, which reaches transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming individuals, Campus Pride, also LGBTQ. Recruit Military for military personnel, NAAP, National Association of Asian Professionals. So there are literally hundreds of organizations out there that can help you facilitate your recruiting, help you increase your applicant pool of qualified personnel, and ultimately chip away at these diversity goals that you're going to be establishing. And also, don't forget search firms, employment agencies, and don't forget employee referral programs. Some of our best people come from referrals. Last slide, please. Just a couple of other points. Number one, we mentioned goals. I mentioned that goals can be short or long-term. There may be some programs that you're going to establish that don't require goals at all. For example, you want to expand with respect to your LGBTQ population. You're not going to establish goals. That data, to my knowledge, is not reported. But you certainly can embark on special programs like contacting some of those organizations that I just mentioned. Your plan overall, the voluntary program, should be reviewed on an annual basis. Let's see where we started the year with respect to our goals. Let's see where we finished the year. What kind of progress did we make? What kind of good faith efforts did we make? Did they help? Do we need to do more? And let's not also forget training programs that we can establish. Remember, they can't be segregated programs. They have to be generally available to all employees. And a couple of don'ts. These are very obvious. Don't ever set aside positions for women or minorities only. Don't establish segregated training programs And of course, you're never going to discharge an employee so that you can place someone else in the job who might be a member of a protected group. So with that, Ephraim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob. So we've heard a bit of the backdrop, the legal framework, and also the three-step process that employers should be undergoing in putting together their programming. If we could move to the next slide. We're now going to be discussing some D&I, some case studies, and some best practices by reviewing some questions that we commonly get from either our clients or that we've just seen within the field. At this time, also, I'm going to provide the CLE code for today's webinar, and that code is SS7362. Again, this is SS7362, my apologies, SS7362. Now, as we discussed before, we're going to be reviewing a few questions that we've seen in our collective experience here and running through some associated risks, some best practices as it relates to each scenario here. Next slide, please. Here's our first scenario. Senior management wants to implement a Rooney-type rule that insists that for each opening, the company also include at least one woman and one person of color in the applicant pool. Is that okay? Bob, would you like to walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely, Ephraim. Bottom line is, just like the Rooney Rule in the NFL, there is nothing unlawful about establishing a Rooney-type rule, certainly in the private sector. What we're doing here with the Rooney Rule is we're trying to expand our applicant pool. We are not insisting that any particular manager or department hire a minority group member or a female. What we are trying to do is get more qualified protected group members into the pool, and with the ultimate goal, of course, to chip away at some of those goals that we've established as part of our diversity initiatives. And I know for a fact the number of companies I work with in the private sector who have established this type of program have made progress because, frankly, they're getting people into the pool, some women, minorities, some cases disabled or LGBTQ, whoever it might be, who might not have been there but for this type of approach. So this is perfectly lawful, and frankly, it's even recommended. But just make sure, again, you don't fall into the trap that the NFL did, and you should be monitoring your applicants, monitoring your hires, just to make sure that the program is working. And any program that's not working, frankly, I discontinue or I tweak to make sure we do other things that get us where we need to be.
And let's go to the next slide. Here's our next one here, which states we want to implement a diversity pledge by which we pledge to double our roster of Black leaders within 5 years. Is that okay? Maria, would you like to let us know your thoughts on that?
Sure. So as long as you have the statistical predicate that there's underutilization of Black individuals within your organization, then I think that this type of diversity pledge would be fine. Again, it just has to be connected to some kind of manifest imbalance in the workplace based on you doing that statistical analysis or analysis of the workforce outside of your organization. And then establishing your program and your diversity pledge based on that. Another kind of point within this, though, is that make sure that this diversity pledge here, it only talks about Black leaders. So I would just make sure that you're considering all races, ethnicities, genders as you're implementing some kind of diversity pledge. So if there's underutilization of women within your workforce or Hispanics within your workforce, I would also make sure that your program is addressing all different types of protected classes. And then I guess the last consideration would just be this 5 years. The requirement is really to make sure that you're implementing the program until you're remedying an imbalance. So that may take 5 years. It could take longer. It could take less time. And I mean, once that imbalance is remedied, if it ever were to happen, then you would be discontinuing the practice at that point. So just a note on kind of these timelines as you're implementing this type of pledge.
Thank you, Maria. We can go to the next slide. Here in this scenario, we have senior management directs human resources to hire 5 senior Black leaders in management during the next year. Is that okay? And I'll field this one and say that this is a situation that probably requires human resources in conjunction with the in-house to go back to senior management to better understand the reasoning behind the specific goal and the timeline that's offered here. Most notably, what's lacking here is any self-analysis regarding whether Black employees are underrepresented within the organization. And more importantly, there's a fundamental question as to what problem is senior management attempting to solve through this type of initiative, because there are multiple ways to attack this issue that does not raise potential red flags. As it's currently presented, it certainly seems as though a particular quota is being assessed here, and it might not even be feasible based upon job openings, setup of the workforce, and the like. So in addressing this issue, you may want to determine whether or not we're talking about whether we are sourcing our candidates. Are we sourcing particular diverse candidates for these roles? Are we having diverse candidates being interviewed? Are you having diverse candidates being selected, right? And another question to be asked here too is the need for 5 Black leaders here. Is it something that relates to your hiring practices, or is it something that relates to your retention of these leaders within the organization? Meaning, are you trying to prevent further attrition or to compensate for it? And if that happens to be the case, after going through that detailed analysis, you can then start to shape and start to put more detail and more specifics around a particular program. Again, we want to be particularly cautious around setting numerical goals. You also want to be cautious in setting timelines for your goals. You want them to be consistent with your manifest imbalance that might be in your workplace, but you want it to be also practical. You want goals that you're actually able to achieve based upon your thorough analysis. Next slide, please. In this scenario here, our company is struggling to retain Black and Latinx employees in our management roles. We would like to start a special company training program solely for Black and Latinx employees, which provides them with business training, soft skill development, and access to company leaders to improve retention. Now, within this particular slide here, this seems as though this company is attempting to create an employee training and development program. What folks here should really understand is that this is a generally permissible aspect of your D&I program, but I encourage folks to think more holistically about their D&I program, meaning they should be thinking about not only employee development and training, but they should also be targeting efforts for improving inclusiveness. They should be also looking at efforts to increase transparency, efforts to have leadership engage, mentorship, and hiring and testing appropriate programs there as well. With this particular program, you want to ask yourself a few questions here. Who are you attempting to target with this program? And here in particular, there's 2 groups that are set aside for the training program. You'll want to be cautious in targeting programs to specific protected classes, because we want to be mindful of the legal restrictions regarding the terms and conditions and privileges of employment. This is something that would certainly fall under that privileges banner here. So you want to ask yourself, in terms of your thought of retaining these types of employees, is it a goal you can meet by expanding the participants within this program. Can you also include, ensure that you include women, LGBTQ individuals, and also individuals from the majority represented employees within the firm as well? You also want to consider the length of time. Is this going to be a long-term program such that each year we'll have a certain cohort that are going through this training? You'll certainly want to at least engage in a pilot program, see how maybe 1-2 sets of cohorts fare through the program as well. And as part of your self-analysis, you'll really want to understand why you're struggling to retain these types of employees in particular. You may embark on this training program, but you may find that perhaps it's not the training aspect that's preventing folks from staying in management or getting elevated into management. It may be separate and different issues that perhaps this program is not touching on. And then the last thing too, when you're considering training programs or mentoring programs within your organization, it's very important that these programs have to be separated or delinked, so to speak, from any formal employment decision. Participants in this program should not be guaranteed promotions, should not be guaranteed increases in compensation or the like. The point of the program is exactly what it is to provide that additional training to these particular individuals. But what they do with that training and development is largely up to them. Going back to the point earlier made, the point here is to increase increase the diversity of your applicant pool, and then from that pool, select the qualified candidates that are going to not only align with the criteria of the job, but also the mission of the firm in general. We can go to the next slide.
Yeah, Ephraim, a question came in the Q&A. Thinking back to the Verna Myers quote, that was diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. There was a question about whether once you kind of have these type of programs, like in the Johnson case, whether inclusion should then be kind of the secondary part of that to make sure that once you have those women in the organization, that they are being asked to dance and included in initiatives from there. Should inclusion always be kind of part of the consideration? What do you guys think on that?
Yeah, I'll quickly say there that it absolutely should. You know, the D&I programs at your organization should be multifaceted. So in terms of getting minority candidates or underrepresented individuals in the door, once they're there, you should be creating programs or initiatives that are going to include them or integrate them more fully within the organization. You know, there should be apparatus created that's going to allow them to have access to stakeholders. You want to go back to those fundamental questions that we asked before, right? The idea is, do they feel valued in the workplace? Do they feel as though they had a voice in the organization's mission? Right, these dovetail with the ideas of inclusiveness. Do they feel secure being who they are? Especially when you're attempting to rectify an imbalance. Many of your initial applicants who are now being hired and placed into the workforce, they're going to be underrepresented within the workforce generally. You're going to have to think of ways of supporting those individuals so that you increase that level of inclusiveness, because you want the sort of the second side of the coin is you have your applicant, they've gone through the process, they've been offered a job, they're now in place in the workplace. Now you need to go and engage in the effort to keep them within the workplace and to have them develop and advance. And usually the best way of doing that is including that your D&I process has inclusionary processes and initiatives involved. And we have our next slide here in our next scenario. It says here that we operate an employee referral program where employees are given a monetary referral bonus for referring successful candidates to the company. Can we offer employees a higher referral bonus if their referral is an underrepresented minority? So is that okay? And Maria, what were your thoughts there?
So I think as long as you have, again, a predicate in place and you've determined that there's some kind of difficulty recruiting certain types of employees, I mean, this type of program isn't without risk. And you read it and it makes you feel a little like, I don't know. But under the law, as long as you have that predicate in place and you've identified that there's difficulty recruiting in candidates of a certain class, and you determine that this is a way that you're going to try to increase increase recruiting and get more applicants within your applicant pool, then I would be comfortable with this approach.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there, Maria, I agree 100%, is when we use the term underrepresented minority, we have to be careful, and that should be as expansive as we can make it. So if we're trying to be all-inclusive for other groups, I'd use a similar type approach for them as well.
And to our last scenario here. For this one, it states we are a federal government contractor with affirmative action plans. Can we also establish a separate diversity plan with goals outside of our AAPs? Bob, can you let us know your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is absolutely yes. And as a matter of fact, there are many government contractors who are required by law, of course, to establish affirmative action plans for each of their facilities or establishments. And those plans are narrowly tailored to that particular establishment or facility. And a lot of clients like to go much broader in their approach. And they kind of establish these umbrella diversity type programs where they're not limited to a particular location or establishment, but where they engage in these programs across the board. And this gets back also to a point I made earlier. There are a lot of HR people, there are a lot of diversity people who don't like the term affirmative action. And they don't want to be associated with the company's affirmative action programs because affirmative action, many believe, has a negative connotation. So again, the reality is separate diversity plans with separate goals are perfectly fine and quite common.
Thank you. And if you go to the next slide here, I believe it's our opportunity to address any remaining questions. I think we've, so just in terms of some questions we've seen, the slide deck will be provided to the participants in the call here, as well as the biographical information for our presenters here. The recording of this webinar will also be made available to the participants. So there won't be a transcript or summary per se that's provided, but there certainly will be a follow-up recording along with this PowerPoint that's going to be available to the folks on our call here today. If we don't have any further questions, I think
there was one additional question just on the handling of PII in the diversity and inclusion, and whether diversity and inclusion information would be included, and whether consent would be needed to collect and store this type of information, and are there any access controls needed or recommended? So I think generally employees' race, gender, disability, et cetera, information would be stored like any other personnel-related information. Medical information should be kept separate than personnel files, but you wouldn't need any kind of additional consent to collect and store this information. Access should, however, be limited to those who need to know, like HR personnel. Of course, this is only for the U.S. Internationally, there would be different requirements with data privacy. And I think those were the questions that came in.
There you go. All right. Well, with those questions, we're going to offer our sincere thank you for all the participants here. It's been a pleasure to discuss these issues here with you today. We certainly hope that it's been informative and helpful for you, as well as your roles within your respective organizations. Again, our contact information is available here, and we'll be following up with both the PowerPoint and a recording of today's sessions. Should you have any other questions or any other thoughts, you can feel free to reach out to Maria, Bob, or myself, as we're happy to assist. Thank you very much.